3 true horror stories with no survivors. Story 1. The house that quietly filled with death, USA. The coroner would later describe the scene as peaceful, but the reality was far worse. An entire family found exactly where they had last felt safe, unaware that the air itself had already decided their fate. No screams, no struggle, just silence settling into every room. Before the story begins, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with your thoughts, and stay to the end, because this first true case proves that the most terrifying horror often leaves no witnesses behind. The house stood on the outskirts of Mapleton, Colorado, a quiet suburban town known for long winters and tightly sealed homes. Built in the early 1990s, the structure was typical for the area: beige siding, a finished basement, and a gas-powered furnace installed when the house was new. It belonged to Michael Harper, a regional logistics manager, his wife Elaine, a former elementary school teacher, and their 2 children, Noah, age 11, and Rachel, age 7. By all outward appearances, nothing about the Harper household suggested danger. Neighbors described them as private but friendly, consistent in routine, and deeply rooted in ordinary life. The night everything ended was a Sunday in late January. Temperatures had dropped well below freezing, forcing the furnace to run almost continuously. Earlier that week, Michael had mentioned to a coworker that the house felt stuffy, but he dismissed it as poor insulation. The furnace, unseen in the basement utility room, had developed a cracked heat exchanger, an internal failure that allowed carbon monoxide, an invisible and odorless gas, to mix freely with the warm air circulating through the home. Carbon monoxide does not announce itself. It does not burn the throat or sting the eyes. It replaces oxygen in the bloodstream, slowly suffocating the brain while creating a sense of drowsy calm. By the time symptoms become severe, most victims are no longer capable of recognizing danger. That Sunday evening followed the family's normal pattern. Dinner was eaten in the kitchen. The dishwasher was loaded. Homework was finished at the dining table. By 9:30 p.m., the children were in their rooms, and the lights downstairs were turned off shortly after. As the furnace cycled on again and again against the cold, the gas began to accumulate. Michael and Elaine were the first to be affected. Reports later indicated that both were found in bed, positioned as if asleep. There was no evidence of movement or alarm. The carbon monoxide levels in the bedroom were estimated to be lethal within less than an hour. As oxygen deprivation set in, confusion and fatigue would have followed, then unconsciousness. Down the hallway, Noah's bedroom told a similar story. He was found lying on his side, school clothes neatly folded on a chair nearby, a book resting open beside the bed. Rachel was discovered in her room with a nightlight still glowing, its soft bulb illuminating a space that had become completely devoid of breathable air. What makes this case especially disturbing is the timeline. Investigators later concluded that the furnace malfunction had likely begun releasing carbon monoxide shortly after midnight. The family may have been exposed for hours before death occurred. At no point did anyone attempt to leave the house. No doors were opened. No windows were broken. Their bodies showed no signs of panic, only the stillness of people who never realized they were dying. The following morning, the first sign that something was wrong came from absence. Elaine failed to show up for a scheduled volunteer shift at the local library. Michael didn't answer repeated calls from his office. By early afternoon, a neighbor noticed the family's car still in the driveway and the porch lights still on despite daylight. Police were dispatched for a welfare check shortly after 3 p.m. When officers entered the home, they immediately felt dizzy, a critical detail that prompted them to evacuate and call the fire department. Emergency crews later confirmed dangerously high carbon monoxide levels throughout the structure. By the time the gas was ventilated, it was already far too late. All 4 members of the Harper family were pronounced dead at the scene. The aftermath revealed a chain of small, fatal oversights. The home had no functioning carbon monoxide detectors. The furnace had not been inspected in over 6 years. The cracked heat exchanger showed signs of gradual deterioration, not sudden failure. This was not a dramatic explosion or a sudden collapse. It was a slow, invisible takeover of the home's air supply. What elevates this incident from tragic to truly horrifying is how ordinary it was. There was no intruder, no violence, no warning signs that anyone could see or smell. The house did exactly what it was designed to do: circulate warm air, while quietly distributing poison into every room. Neighbors later described an overwhelming sense of dread when the truth emerged. Many admitted they had never tested their own detectors. Some had none installed at all. The Harper home was sold months later after extensive remediation, but residents reported that new owners never stayed long. Multiple families moved out within a year, citing an unexplained heaviness in the house, despite no further mechanical issues ever being found. From a factual standpoint, the case was closed quickly. Cause of death: accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. No criminal negligence. No survivors. Yet the psychological impact lingered far beyond the official reports. A home is supposed to be a barrier against the outside world. In this case, it became the weapon. The walls trapped the gas. The sealed windows prevented escape. The furnace, meant to provide warmth, became the source of death. There was nothing supernatural about what happened in Mapleton, Colorado. And that is exactly why it remains terrifying. The horror did not stalk the family. It waited. It blended in. And when it finished, it left behind a house full of bodies that looked as though they had simply gone to sleep, never knowing that the very air around them had already turned against them. Story 2. The ground that decided to move, USA. The first thing to disappear was the sound of the river, then the road, then the houses themselves, erased so completely that rescuers would later struggle to determine where walls had ever stood. In the early morning darkness near Oso, Washington, entire homes were swallowed in seconds, leaving behind nothing recognizable as human shelter, only a mass of earth where people had been alive moments earlier. The community of Steelhead Haven sat along State Route 530, nestled between a steep hillside and the North Fork of the Stillaguamish River. It was a quiet, rural neighborhood made up mostly of manufactured homes and small family houses, many of them owned by longtime residents who valued isolation and scenery over convenience. The hillside towering above them had a documented history of instability. Smaller landslides had occurred there for decades. Reports existed. Studies had been written. But life continued beneath the slope. On the morning of March 22, 2014, after weeks of heavy rain, the hillside finally gave way. At approximately 10:37 a.m., an estimated 10 million cubic yards of earth collapsed and accelerated downhill at catastrophic speed. Mud, trees, rocks, and debris surged across the valley floor, obliterating everything in its path. The slide traveled across the river, dammed it instantly, and continued into the residential area with unstoppable force. Inside one of the homes lived David Kearns, age 58, and his partner Linda Morales, age 54. They had moved to Steelhead Haven nearly a decade earlier, drawn by affordability and privacy. Their house sat directly in the slide's path. According to investigators, neither had any meaningful warning. Survivors farther away reported a low, growing roar, but those closest to the hillside would have had seconds, if that. The structure was not crushed. It was removed. Pieces of roofing, insulation, and framing were later found embedded deep within the debris field, scattered beyond recognition. Neither David nor Linda was ever found intact. Their remains were identified weeks later through fragments recovered from the mud. Nearby, another household disappeared entirely. The Novak family, Thomas, 43, Aaron, 41, and their 2 teenage children, were home that Saturday morning. The family had planned to run errands later that day. Their house stood on land that maps later showed was considered moderate risk, a classification that proved meaningless when the slope collapsed at full scale. The landslide hit with enough force to snap mature trees like matchsticks and bury homes under up to 70 feet of debris. The pressure was so intense that air pockets inside houses would have collapsed instantly. There was no survivable space, no opportunity for escape. The mud behaved like liquid concrete, filling every cavity. Rescue efforts were delayed almost immediately, not due to lack of urgency, but because the ground itself remained unstable. Secondary slides continued for days. The debris field was so dangerous that responders were forced to retreat repeatedly. The area was declared a mass casualty site, not a rescue zone. What makes this event especially horrifying is that many of the victims were not asleep, not isolated, not unaware of the world. They were awake in their homes, engaged in ordinary weekend routines, when the environment they trusted became a moving wall of death. Geologists later confirmed that the hillside had failed before, including a significant slide in 2006. Warnings had been issued about development in the area. Still, homes remained. Insurance was available. No evacuation orders were active. Life continued as if the land were stable, until it wasn't. The aftermath was chaotic and grim. Over 40 people were confirmed dead, many of them never fully recovered. Some victims were located months later. Others were never found at all. Entire households vanished, leaving behind no survivors to describe what happened inside their homes during those final seconds. Families waiting for answers faced an unbearable reality. There would be no final conversations, no explanations, no confirmation of when or how consciousness was lost. The violence of the slide erased those details forever. Investigators reconstructed timelines using phone records, GPS data, and fragments of household items recovered from the debris. In several cases, mobile phones showed active usage minutes before the landslide. A text message sent. A call placed. Then nothing. Unlike fires or storms, a landslide does not offer progressive warning. There is no smell, no visible flame, no gradual encroachment. It is sudden, total, and indifferent. The houses in Steelhead Haven did not fail structurally. They were simply overpowered by the earth itself. In the months that followed, surviving relatives pushed for accountability. Lawsuits were filed. Reports were re-examined. Terms like known hazard and acceptable risk became part of public discussion. But none of it altered the fundamental truth. People had trusted the ground beneath their homes, and the ground had betrayed them without mercy. The site of the slide was eventually declared uninhabitable. The neighborhood was abandoned. Nature reclaimed what remained. Grass grew over the mud. Trees were replanted. To an untrained eye, the area might eventually look peaceful again. But beneath that surface lies a compressed mass of debris containing fragments of homes, vehicles, furniture, and human lives, entombed where they stood. This was not a freak accident in the sense of randomness. It was a delayed consequence, years in the making, that culminated in seconds. No intruder crossed a threshold. No device malfunctioned. The horror came from the land itself, moving with enough force to erase entire families without giving them time to understand what was happening. In Oso, Washington, the safest place people believed they had, their homes, became the exact location where survival was impossible. And when the earth finally settled, it left behind a silent field where no one remained to tell the story from inside. Story 3. The night the building let go, USA. At 1:22 a.m. in Surfside, Florida, a beachfront condominium that had stood for 40 years made a sound survivors later described as thunder tearing itself apart. Within seconds, half of the structure was gone. Apartments where people had been sleeping, watching television, or lying awake in the dark were no longer rooms at all. Just falling concrete, dust, and bodies pulled straight down into a collapsing void. The building was known as Champlain Towers South, a 12-story residential complex overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. It housed retirees, families, seasonal residents, and long-term owners who believed they lived in one of the safest environments imaginable, a secured condominium with ocean views, routine maintenance, and no history of major disasters. On the night of June 24, 2021, that belief ended permanently. In apartment 111 lived Judy Spiegel, age 66, and her husband Erwin, age 80. They had spent the evening watching television. Judy spoke briefly with her sister on the phone earlier that night, mentioning nothing unusual, no noise, no shaking, no warning signs. Minutes later, their apartment ceased to exist. The section of the building containing their unit collapsed straight down, pancaking floor by floor until nothing remained but rubble compressed into an unrecognizable mass. Above them, entire families were asleep. Stacy Fong, age 31, had recently moved into the building with her young son. She was a newly divorced mother rebuilding her life. Her apartment was located directly above the initial failure point. Investigators later concluded that once the lower floors gave way, everything above followed almost instantly. There was no time to run, no time to wake, no time to understand. Both mother and child were killed in the collapse. What makes this incident uniquely horrifying is not only the suddenness, but the internal decay that preceded it. For years, water had been seeping into the building's concrete support structures from the pool deck and underground garage. Saltwater corrosion slowly ate away at the steel reinforcement hidden inside the columns and slabs. Residents had complained about cracks, falling concrete, and flooding in the garage during storms. An engineering report issued in 2018 warned of major structural damage and urgent repair needs. Those repairs never happened. On the night of the collapse, most residents were inside their homes. Some were asleep, some were awake. One resident, Barry Cohen, survived only because his apartment was in the portion of the building that did not immediately fall. He later described being thrown from his bed by a violent jolt and emerging into a hallway filled with dust so thick he could barely breathe. He escaped barefoot, bleeding, surrounded by screams coming from a pile of debris where his neighbors had been moments earlier. For those trapped inside the collapsed section, survival was nearly impossible. The building did not fall outward, it collapsed inward. Floors stacked on top of each other with crushing force. Oxygen was eliminated almost instantly in many voids. Temperatures rose as fires ignited within the debris. The weight above compressed everything below into dense layers of concrete, furniture, and human remains. Search and rescue teams worked non-stop for weeks. Heavy machinery had to be used carefully to avoid further collapse. Each recovery was treated with the weight of certainty that no one inside the debris was alive. The site became a recovery operation, not a rescue. In total, 98 people were killed. Some families waited days to receive confirmation. Others waited weeks. Many never received complete remains. Identifications were made through DNA fragments recovered from rubble. Entire households were erased. Parents, children, grandparents, leaving behind no one who had been inside those apartments to describe what the final moments felt like. The horror of Champlain Towers South lies in the betrayal of permanence. Buildings are meant to endure. Walls are meant to hold. Floors are meant to support. Residents trust that while they sleep, the structure around them will remain unchanged. In Surfside, that trust was catastrophically misplaced. The aftermath revealed failures at multiple levels: deferred maintenance, delayed action, financial hesitation, and underestimation of risk. But none of those explanations matter to the dead. For them, the horror was immediate and absolute. One moment, they were in their homes. The next, gravity took over. Today, the site is empty. The remaining portion of the building was demolished months later for safety reasons. A memorial now stands nearby, marking a space where a residential tower once rose above the shoreline. Tourists walk past it unaware that beneath their feet was once a vertical neighborhood that collapsed without warning. This was not an explosion, not an attack, not a natural disaster in the traditional sense. It was a quiet failure that reached a breaking point at night, when people were most vulnerable inside the place they believed offered protection. In Surfside, Florida, the horror did not enter through a door or window. It came from within the walls themselves, and when they finally gave way, no one trapped inside lived to tell what those final seconds were like. If this story stayed with you, don't ignore it. These are not legends. They are real homes, real people, and real endings. Subscribe if you want more true horror that actually happened. Leave a comment with which story disturbed you the most, and share this video so these victims aren't forgotten. Silence lets horror repeat itself.